proceed now with Article 3 of Question 2 of the Prima Pars of Aquinas' Summa Theologia. And here we get to the meat of the matter. This is where Aquinas asks whether God exists. And here he provides two objections. Let's simply read the first one. So he says, "It seems that God does not exist," says the objector, "because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would altogether be destroyed. But the name God means that he is infinite goodness. If, therefore, God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world. Therefore, God does not exist." This is the perennial argument against God. It's sometimes called the argument of theodicy. The fact of evil existing in the world challenges the infinite and all good existence of God. How can there be two contrary infinite beings? We can go ahead and scroll down to the reply to this monumental objection and see what Aquinas says. He quotes Augustine, who says, "Since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works, unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. So it's not simply that if there is an infinite good, there cannot be any evil, but rather God is the infinite good who is greater than any evil, and he would not allow evil to exist in itself or in his good works. But the fact that evil does exist does not make God lesser, but rather it points to the omnipotence of God such that even from evil, God can bring forth goodness." Let's reverse back to the main argument. So after the objection, Aquinas here returns. In the said contra, he quotes Scripture as the authority. And here he is quoting Exodus 3:14, a very famous passage, and it is God himself. It is said in the person of God. God speaks, and he says, "I am who am. Ego eimi." And if you recall from your Old Testament studies, this is from the scene in which Moses encounters the burning bush and asks God, "Well, who are you? Who will I say to Pharaoh sent me?" And God reveals himself. "I am." He is the ground of all being. A question in which Aquinas is examining, does God exist? He first starts with God's own voice, quoting God saying, "Yes, I do exist. I am." But how will Aquinas proceed to argue for the existence of God utilizing reason? Here he begins in the Respondio. "I answer that the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. So this is how we have the 5 proofs of God. The first of these is also known as the unmoved mover. It's the argument of motion. Aquinas says, "The first and more manifest way is the argument for motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now whatever is moved by another, for nothing can be moved except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is moved." What does he mean? When Aquinas refers to motion, he is not speaking of locomotion in the same way that we mean by motion if you move from one chair to another, from one location to another location. Rather, motion in the philosophical sense is the reduction from potentiality to actuality by virtue of an act, something that is at rest or has the potential for movement, for act, is acted upon by something already in act and brought, therefore, to actuality. He says this, "A thing moves inasmuch as it is in act, for motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality." So if we take a look at our pendulum down here, these balls, which are not in motion, have the potential to be in motion. How can they start moving? For these balls which are at rest to start entering into motion, they must be acted upon by something else which is already in action or in act. And that would be this first ball, which is pulled, and it starts the activity or the motion. So it hits the other balls and sets them into motion. And when they start to move, then their potentiality for motion has been actualized. Now Aquinas gives an example of this. Thus, he says, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood which is potentially hot to be actually hot. So if the ball here, using a different analogy, if this is fire, and this is the ball that's already in action, it's in act, so fire itself is already fully hot. That's the quality of fire, to be hot. So the act is hot. If this is a log of wood, which is not yet hot, it has the potentiality to be made hot. How? By being acted upon by something that is hot, such as the fire. So if we take the fire and heat the wood which is cold and potentially hot, actually becomes actually hot. Nothing can be reduced from potentiality, potentially cold wood, to actuality, actually hot, except by something in a state of actuality. The fire is in the state of actuality of hot. Thus, that which is actually hot as fire makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. What he means by this is what is potential is moving or is capable of moving towards what is actual. And what is actually hot can cease to be actually hot and revert to a state of potentiality. And a thing cannot be both fully potentially and actually the same thing at the same time. The wood cannot be both hot and cold at the same time. It is potentially hot or actually hot, potentially cold or actually cold. So it's not possible that the same things can be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect. Now, what does this have to do with God? Good question. Let's keep reading. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, that it should move itself. Okay, so if what is actual is the movement, the mover is actual, you can only have an actual mover, which cannot be both actually mover and potentially moved. So the mover is an act. And when it is an act, it is not potentially moved, but it is moving. Therefore, he says, whatever is moved must be moved by another. So these balls here are potentially in motion. They can potentially be reduced to actuality. But how so? Only when there is something that is actually in motion, acting upon it, setting it into motion. If that by which it is moved be itself moved, then this also must needs to be moved by another, and that by another. So here we see these are potentially in motion. This one is in motion. The one in actual motion acts upon the potential to be moved and starts it moving. But how does this ball actually have the actuality of movement? It is actually being acted upon by some other actor or some other mover. So you must use your fingers and pull this ball, move it, and release it in order to set it into action. So the hand of the person would be the next step back, the actual mover that's moving this mover to move these and set them in motion. So what you're seeing here is we're tracing back the motion to a prior mover. Now note, we're going to trace this back ad infinitum, because who is moving the hand? Well, maybe it's the mind that's moving the hand. Who's moving the mind? Well, maybe there's a reason, or there's a command that's being given to the person who is playing this with this pendulum, and who's moving them. You can continue this all the way back until you get to infinity, and if you don't actually posit a first unmoved mover, one who does not need to be moved upon, to be acted upon, to set things into motion, then if you don't have a first unmoved mover, then you don't actually have any movers at all. But in actuality, if we look around or if we look at ourselves, the fact that we are here says that, there was something who set us in motion, and something or someone who set them in motion, and all the way back, and it must trace itself back to a mover who himself is not moved. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, that it should move itself, because these balls at rest cannot move themselves. Therefore, whatever is moved must be moved by another. If that by which is moved to be itself moved, then this also must needs be moved by another, and that by another, all the way back. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover and consequently no other mover, seeing that the subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are moved by the first mover. So we have to have a first mover, and that first mover cannot be moved himself, because whoever moved him would have to have been moved by something else, unless there is actually a first unmoved mover, as the staff moves only because it is moved by the hand. Therefore, it is necessary, says Aquinas, to arrive at a first mover moved by no other, and this, he says, everyone understands to be God. Okay? The fact that we are here says that something set us in motion, set us into existence, and you could say it was the love of your parents in an act of love, and they conceived of you. Well, someone, their parents, moved in such a way that brought them into existence. And again, we trace this back all the way until we must arrive at a first unmoved mover. Because if we do not, we either go infinitely back in time amongst a series of movers, and therefore we never actually have a real beginning. But that does not make sense, because the fact is, in the concrete reality here and now, we are actually here. We are actually in motion. And so there must be a first unmoved mover. And that is the first argument. So you see how this is a very philosophical argument. Nowhere does it rely on faith, but rather Aquinas is employing reason to prove the existence of God, or if not to prove, to demonstrate, to show that it is reasonable to posit a first unmoved mover, and that unmoved mover is what we call God. The second demonstration is actually very similar to the first, but here we must note how precise Aquinas actually is. So remember, the first argument had to do with motion. The second argument is extremely similar, but it's not about motion. It's about causality. So it's another way of looking at the same kind of series of movements, but looking at it in terms of cause and effect. Scroll down further. The second way, says Aquinas, is from the nature of efficient cause. In the world of sensible things, we find there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. Nothing can cause itself. Everything is caused by some other cause outside itself. For so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Okay, so you cannot bring yourself into existence. Rather, there is some other efficient cause. Now, in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity, because in all efficient causes following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. Now, to take away a cause is to take away an effect. So, think of when you stack up your dominoes into a nice long line, and then you say Hurricane Laura comes and you tip the first one and the whole row of dominoes tumbles down. That's the idea. That very first tipping of the first domino is that first cause. The first domino hits the second. That's an intermediate cause. That intermediate cause hits the third domino, and on and on and on, so that we have a series of causes. And he's saying that if you take away the cause, you take away the effect. So if you take away the first cause, which, as we're saying here, the first efficient cause is God. If you take God away, if God did not exist, you would not have any of the effects. And yet, here we are. We are the effects. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause. Neither will there be an ultimate effect. So you'd lose the effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes. All of which is plainly false. It's false because we do exist. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name God. So another very philosophical argument in which Aquinas employs reason to posit the existence of God. Now, Aquinas' third argument for the existence of God is the argument of necessity. And the opposite of necessity is contingency or dependency. Now, is our own existence necessary? To be or not to be, said Hamlet. Is it necessary that we exist? Is it necessary that we will always exist? No, it's not. Actually, there was a time when I did not yet exist. And there will be certainly will be a time when I cease to exist, at least in the form that I am existing now. So the reality of our contingency, the fact of our being as so contingent, points to the reality of a necessary being, which sustains all of these contingent beings. Why else would we have real existence, though contingent existence, if it were not necessary? Okay, so let's take a look at the text itself. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity and runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to be corrupted, and consequently it is possible for them to be and not to be. But it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which can not be at some time is not. So the fact that there was a time when I was not says that I am not necessary. That's the reality. The plain truth, my dears, is that we don't know exactly where you will be in a week or 2 or 5 years or 10 years. But one truth that we hold for certain, for sure, is that there will be a time when we cease to exist. Now that sounds like a rather morbid thought, but it's actually a sober thought. This is the reality of human existence. We are not invincible. We are not immortal. And yet we do exist. What does this tell us? Therefore, he continues, if everything cannot be, then at one time there was nothing in existence. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist begins to exist only through something already existing. So there has to be the fact that we are so contingent, so merely possible. The fact that I, a very contingent being, exists here and now says that there must be a single necessary being, a being which is absolutely necessary, in contrast to my absolute contingency. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. If everything is contingent, if everything is dependent, nothing is absolute, then how or why does anything exist anyways? Well, things exist because not everything is contingent. There is an absolute necessary being. And that is what we mean when we refer to God. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another, okay, that was the series of causes as we saw in the previous demonstration, or it does not have the necessity caused by another, meaning there is a series of causes and there is a first cause who himself is unmoved, that first unmoved mover. Now, it is impossible to go on to infinity and necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has already been proved in regard to efficient causes. So that infinite series, we don't want to fall into ad infinitum, going into infinity without any beginning. And if there's no beginning, then there shouldn't be anything here. And that would be the wrong direction to argue. Therefore, we cannot but admit the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God. So that's the third demonstration, based on contingency and necessity. Consider this question here. So the conundrum seems to be, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? So if you say, well, the egg comes first because the chicken is hatched from the egg, then the other argument would be, no, the chicken must come first, because if you have an egg, who's going to hatch it if there's not a chicken to hatch the egg? I say the answer is actually very simple. Aquinas here is saying both the chicken and the egg are contingent upon each other. Therefore, there must be an absolute being that brings forth the chicken, the first chicken that actually lays the egg and hatches the egg, and that absolute being is God. The fourth way is the way of gradation or perfection. And this is what Aquinas writes. The fourth way is taken from the gradation to be found in things. Among beings there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and the like. So there's a gradation of qualities of being. There are beings that are good, true, and noble, and then there are beings that are lesser in goodness, truth, and nobility. But more and less are predicted of different things according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum. Okay, the fact that there is gradation points to an absolute perfection. There cannot be more or less if there is not a maximum, a cause of all in that genus. If you say, wow, that's a nice blue sky, but you say, no, it's not as blue as it was on the 4th of July. Well, you say, how can there be more blue and less blue? Unless there is a measurement that is standard and you consider that to be, that's what blue is. There must be a perfection of blue in order for you to say, oh, something is more or less of that quality. There is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is most being. For those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being, as it is written in Metaphysics 2. Now, the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus. Okay? As fire, the maximum of heat, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, their goodness, in every other perfection, and this we call God. So every perfection is to be found in God. And the ultimate perfection is that perfection of being. God is that perfect being who gives us being, and our beings are contingent upon His. And then lastly, we have the fifth way. And the fifth way is the way of the governance of the world, or it's looking at the design and finality of the world. And as you notice here, this is the fifth way. It's this last paragraph before the reply to the first objection. There are 5 demonstrations, and each subsequent one gets shorter and shorter. It's as if Aquinas is building on the previous argument, and the evidence is just so clear, it's obvious, that he does not have to argue at great length. That's the first thing to notice. The second is that, again, all of these arguments, all of these demonstrations are derived from argumentation, from reason. The fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack knowledge, such as natural bodies, act for an end. So notice here that Aquinas is turning to something different. Previously, he was looking at motion, causality, as insofar as we see it within ourselves. Now he's turning to the natural world, which as a natural body lacks knowledge. He will say that even in things that are not animated by a soul, and they themselves lack a knowledge, they too act for an end. There's order in this universe. And it's not because the universe is thinking, oh, how shall the sun rise? Should I rise today on the east, or should I rise in the west? No, it's not a conscious consideration, an exercise of agency, but rather it's natural bodies acting for an end. And this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. So these are the laws of nature, patterns that we see written into nature that are orderly and seemingly intelligible, though nature itself does not have an intellect or a will. Hence, it is plain that they achieve their end not fortuitously, but designedly. So if things which lack knowledge act for an end, how is it that it does not have the knowledge to choose for itself? How is it acting so orderly? And he gives us this wonderful example. Now, whatever lacks knowledge cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is directed by the archer. So here you have the arrow. The arrow is not deciding, well, which route should I take? Should I go around the trees? Should I take a left, take a right? Should I hit the bullseye or not? The arrow is not deciding. Rather, if the arrow does indeed hit the bullseye, it's not because the arrow is intelligent, but rather because the arrow is being directed by an intelligent archer. In the same way, we look at the natural universe. And the universe, which in itself lacks intelligence, does act intelligently because it is ordered, it is directed by an intelligent God, an intelligent creator. Therefore, says Aquinas, some intelligent beings exist by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So this final demonstration for the existence of God is based on design and finality. It's the orderedness that we see in the universe, or even the orderedness that we see in our own lives. So if you go home and you find a new computer set up with all of the cords plugged into the right place and fully functioning, it's not because someone opened the box that was shipped from Dell or Amazon and threw out all the parts into the air and it landed in the right place, but rather your spouse or your parents or your brother or sister got to the box first, read the directions, and intelligently put everything together. So our universe manifests this intelligence which points to an intelligent first being, that being God. So let's review the 5 proofs or the 5 demonstrations. And remember, the first is the unmoved mover, this motion which is set into action by a first mover who himself is unmoved, and this we call God. The second, we have a series of causes that give rise to effects. And if we trace back the effects starting with ourselves, we must arrive at a first cause. Otherwise, we fall into a series of infinite causes, and therefore there shouldn't be anything existing. And yet we do exist as the effects of this first cause. The third demonstration had to do with contingency or possibility, to be or not to be. The fact that we are contingent beings points to the reality of an absolute necessary being, and that is God. The fourth demonstration looked at the beauty and gradations of perfection in our world, pointing to the perfection of all of these qualities in an absolute being, the maximum of existence, the maximum of goodness and truth and beauty, and that we call God. And then lastly, we look at the governance and order of the world, the intelligent design of even unintelligent things, pointing to the reality that they have been ordered by an intelligent being, and that too we call God. In each of the 5 proofs, Aquinas looks at the world. His point of departure is the cosmos, and the order and being, nobility, contingency, frailty of the universe. And when one inquires into the ultimate ground of this world and of our existence within this world, we are directed to, or our minds are directed to, God himself. Even in the face of the possibility of non-being, we realize the positive character of the world, the positive character of actual being, and we come upon the wonder of being, like we saw in Albacetti's 3rd chapter. There's this wonder and positivity when we look at the world in this way. The wonder of being reveals itself to us in the face of the possibility of nothingness. And yet, it's not that there's nothing here. Rather, reality, in Aquinas' perspective, is reliable, it's solid and beautiful. And so insofar as it is reality here and now, what is cannot not be. This explains our wonder and awe at being in the cosmos. It makes explicit our own implicit knowledge. We grasp reality in this way, and we come to know God in this way as well. And this is why Aquinas' proofs, or demonstrations, are called cosmological proofs rather than ontological. He does not attempt to start in the ontology of God. Rather, as we saw him say in the first article, the very essence, the very being of God is off limits to us. He is ineffable. He is infinite. We are finite. We can't probe the mystery, the essence of God. So we can't start from the cause and argue towards the effect, but rather, as we saw in the second article, by way of demonstration, Aquinas starts in the effects, the world around us, the cosmos, and hence cosmological. He starts with the concrete being that we have and we are, and he argues back to the ultimate absolute, first and unmoved being, whom, philosophically, he concludes we can call God.